Welcome to Word on Your Street. I'm your host, Shelly, and today we have a guest.
Hi, I'm Ruby Mendoza, she, her, and I'm an assistant professor of English in LGBT studies at Santa Clara University.
Oh my gosh, well, thank you for joining me today. Let's just kind of dive deep into this. So what is your personal journey and kind of what shapes your positionality? We're going to be talking a lot about trans remembrance and just having a focus on that, especially that the day is coming up very soon. So just please feel free to share about yourself.
Yeah, so again, my name is Ruby. I'm from San Jose, California, so I'm local to the Santa Clara community, but I didn't have a very privileged and exciting life. I don't come from a background of scholars. I don't even come from a background with parents who have an educational degree. I don't even have parents who have a high school diploma. So I'm a product of the parents who are, who migrated to this country and fought to survive. And I was raised by a single mother. My educational history has been kind of exciting, but also challenging. Like I've mentioned, I didn't have any figures to learn how to access education. So my background solely focused on thinking about how to survive. And so when I lived in San Jose, California, over 2 decades ago, I was a high school dropout. I worked odd jobs to survive and did things, I think it's inappropriate to mention the podcast, to survive. But it wasn't until my 20s when I entered back at a community college, got my GED, and really found the love for stories and experiences. And so I went to De Anza Community College, which is actually down the street from here, where I was mentored by other queer folks such as Dr. Roseanne Quinn, who's still there, which is exciting. And I transferred to Chico State because that's all I could afford. I didn't have money to go to a UC or a big school. Went there, learned the art of rhetoric and writing studies, and then transferred to San Diego State, where I got a degree in rhetoric and writing studies. And it was in that program that shaped my experience of rhetoric and storytelling and performance and queer and trans theory, which then led into my PhD program, where I looked and focused primarily on queer and trans stories of color who navigate higher education. And so, full circle, I'm back in the Bay Area as a professor.
Oh my gosh. Well, thank you for sharing all of that. Honestly, I feel like, in the small time I got to know you, I just feel like everything you say and everything you do is such a genuine energy and compassion and light. And I'm so excited to get into this.
Oh,
with you.
Yes. Thank you. That's so nice. I don't know about that, y'all. Shelly's a liar. I'm kidding.
Okay, so let's kind of go into the beginning. So we kind of, through this episode, we really want people to experience this part of our community, and I feel like often it's been overshadowed, not talked about enough, and this is a perfect moment since Trans Remembrance Day is around the corner.
It's literally in 2 days from this recording.
Yes. So let's just kind of go around the history a little bit. I'm wondering, so when was the first recorded medical clinic that supported transitioning with hormones and surgery? And if you can give me kind of a historical background and how it has both reaffirmed the community as well.
Yeah, so it's important to note that trans experiences have existed for quite some time. There's even references to the Antiquity period, which is where Athens, Greece, and those things have emerged. But when we think about medical clinics and a lot of the scientific research that has manifested over the few past centuries, it was really into the 20th century, the 1900s, where we saw one of the first institutes of sexology that was formed, I think, in the 1920s, maybe a little earlier, by a scholar named and doctor named Magnus Hirschfeld, who was born in 1968 and would then die in 1935. And he was world renowned at that time in the 20s because during the clinic's existence, thousands of patients were seen and treated, often for free. So that was important. And the Institute also achieved a global reputation for its pioneering work on transsexual understanding and calls for equity for just not only homosexuals, but transgender people and women. And so Hirschfeld himself was a passionate advocate for both the gay and transgender rights, even during a time where Germany was not so accepting with homosexuality. And so when we think about that sexology center, it's important to know that, because I think a lot of folks are convinced that trans medicine is this current contemporary thing that has just surprisingly emerged. It has not, right? And we're seeing the discourse where we're trying to eradicate it. And so when I think about it, we also have to think, whatever happened to that center? Things that are happening now are what are happening then. The Nazi Germany took over the center, burned the books, burned the center down. It was a notable moment in history. And so that was a significant loss on the community, because a lot of those records are unrecoverable. And we don't know the true extent of what trans medical work looked like in a lot of ways, but we have the stories and we have the figure, and that's the most important thing. I think what's also another important fact is that a transgender center actually existed here in California in the 60s, for I think 68 to 1979, and that was actually at Stanford Universities, and I think the center was called Gender Dysphoria Program, and it really led into prominence by a gender-affirming care director of Donald R. Lab. And so that was a really great, renowned place for folks to access healthcare in the 20th century, and his work has also led into the 21st century. So when we think about these medical histories, we got to think that they've existed in the 20th century and now into the 21st century, but we don't talk about like this history exists. And I think that these institutions not being recognized or acknowledged is intentional, and it's an act of erasure. And so when we think about trans figures, I always think about C. Riley Snorton's book. I can't think of the title on the top of my head, who represents a critical figure and cultural scholar who has extensively talked about trans issues. And so he has talked about even the existence of Black trans folks since the 19th century. And so I think what we're acknowledging is that there is this rich legacy and history of figures, and I'm glad that it's being documented now so it can circulate and be reaffirmed.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. I think also just seeing like the intersect between like modern day and historical, I think there's a power to have like a history with your people and to like be able to like present and show that this has been existing in a long question for a long time versus like this random modern issue that has just appeared. Like I feel like it's a way to most mitigate the community, but then also the element of erasure that you were talking about is really prevalent and still is happening currently in history.
Yeah, and I would add too that it counters the dominant narrative that's happening now, right? And what I mean by that for the audience who's listening is thinking that we're pushing back against some of that discourse, because when we think about it, people often are saying you're being hyperbolic, you're being dramatic, right? And the fact that you're relating these incidents to fascism. But there's, like you just mentioned, a direct correlation to what's happening now that was happening then with Nazi Germany. So there is a history and there are trends that are emerging and looking forward that could literally impact transgender people and people who are not trans. So it's a very dangerous time.
Thank you. I just curious to kind of talk about the experience. I know a lot of people who are listening probably are not really familiar with the trans community. And so I want to just kind of just asking about what is the relationship between medical transitioning and social transitioning and making a distinction between the two. And then also like, why is it so important to have this gender affirming care with medical transitioning? Because I feel like there's a lot of backlash behind it, but there is really a lot of strength and power towards the trans community. So I'm just curious of like what you could say to that and like what would you want people to know?
Yeah, so the way that I'm going to describe it is hopefully the most simplistic form, but it's not the most extensive. So medical transitioning is when a trans person decides to get medical intervention of any capacity to affirm their gender. And so we think of, most prominently, people think of vaginoplasty, so male to female, right? Or people think of breast reduction for trans female to male, right? We think of these large surgeries, in fact, that can create affirming gender for the person who's seeking that treatment. Transition is more than that. It's Botox, which can create femininity. It's also fillers. It's laser hair removal. It's also getting access to endocrinology for dealing with ways of how to navigate hormones. And it's just so expansive. And it's also important to note that there are trans people who don't seek medical transition. So it's a complex issue, and for those who seek it, there are so many routes and endeavors to go through that. And that also can help them feel more comfortable when they want to socially transition. And so what I mean by socially transition, it's a fully distinct and different than medical transition. It's thinking about how to dress and appear in a way that socially fits with your current society's climate. And so when I think the most simplistic form of thinking about gender, it's often prescribed. So boys get to wear blue, girls get to wear pink, right? That's a simplistic form. It's not true for all statements, but that's like a general kind of statement that's often made. And so maybe a trans woman who went from male to female wants to socially transition and look more feminine. So they're going to buy more feminine clothing and socially transition in that way. And maybe they'll start using the preferred name and change to the ways that they can enact and feel comfortable in society at large. And was there a second question? I can't remember, Shelly.
Oh, I think you hit all the points,
Okay.
but I guess like a question is coming up for me. I don't know if this is like, if there's like a standard for everybody or different, but like what is the power to be able to like pick a name for yourself, and like what is that process through, and like how is it both like empowering and just like transformative toward like the way you see yourself and your identity?
That's such a good question and not an easy one to answer. So I can only talk from my experience. When I chose Ruby, it was actually the name my mom said that was my original name because the doctors told her that I was supposed to be a girl. Ironic, right? And I'm a trans woman now. And so they were going to name me Ruby, which was in essence a reflection of, I'm going to say my dead name, please do not repeat it, people, of Ruben, of my uncle who died in Mexico from a car accident. And so they wanted to honor his legacy and his life, and that was my father's brother. And so they wanted me to name me after him in some capacity. So it was supposed to be Ruby, but then it went to Ruben. But when I was growing up, people would call me Ruby Booby. Like, maybe because I was thicker and plus size, and I, had the area that looked more feminine on top. TMI. But that's what people would call me. And so Ruby just stuck, right? And for me, when I transitioned, everyone thought I was going to choose Mariah because I'm a huge Mariah Carey fan, but it was Ruby. Even though that name was used to be teased, I felt like it had a legacy for me to be who I needed to be and who I was meant to be before I was even born, right? And so choosing Ruby was that reason, because it's just, for me personally, that's what it looked like. But that's not the case for all trans people. Their names come from whatever their stories are.
Well, thank you for sharing. That was, oh, that's so sweet. I feel like that was so like full circle.
I know, it's a little weird, right? Yeah.
Well, like, let's kind of transition into like figures and what figures were most influential for you and shaped the way you understood the trans community.
Yeah, so I live at the intersections of not just being a trans woman, but being a person of color. I am Latina, and so that has been a really huge moment in my life. And I couldn't say I experienced what it meant to be undocumented, but I've seen the experience from my family because my parents both are undocumented, and saw those real-lived experiences in navigating the system of America. We are in a governmental institution that is a system, right, that wasn't welcoming to those individuals. And so the figures, as I was beginning my transition 15 years ago, it's been a slow process, began with Bambi Salcido. For those who do not know who she is, she's an internationally recognized transgender Latina activist, social justice advocate, a movement builder whose work has transformed the landscape of not just trans rights, but the rights of trans individuals who are undocumented. She is the president and CEO of Trans Latina Coalition, and it's one of the largest, most influential organizations in the United States. And it's dedicated, right, for the rights and dignity and well-being of transgender, gender expansive, and intersex Latina people. So that was someone who was really influential in my life because the stories that she shared about navigating sex work and all these things were similar to my life. And so it just showed a real connection of what it means to be trans and dealing with society in a way that where whiteness is celebrated and Latino and undocumented and being brown was not. There's also some other figures that I think are really important to highlight, including maybe Amara Jones. She's the founder of Translash, which shares authentic experiences of trans and gender nonconforming people. Through her journalism and nonfiction storytelling, she represents an incredible figure because she does the work that matters to me as well. And that is, she tells stories of current discourse that's happening in our society and counters them by showing and interviewing actual historians and people who are doing the work. And so her work is so monumental and it's life-saving. And of course, maybe my last one will be Kumahina. We got to watch that documentary.
Yes.
And so Kumahina is a Hawaiian indigenous person, and she's Mahu. And in Hawaiian culture, that is a derogatory term. But she reclaimed it, and Mahu is the expansiveness of Hawaiian culture, where a person sits between the genders of male and female. And that really is a powerful story because it shows the impacts of colonization and shows the impacts of how, these histories of trans existence are being eradicated because of colonialism. And then it also shows what it means in that documentary, in her work. It means to reclaim the history of Hawaiian culture. She's also working with government, and also what it means to navigate a colonial system as someone who has that Hawaiian traditional legacy. So that's another figure I think I truly care and honestly admire as a pivotal figure.
Wow. Yeah, thank you. I feel like it's really interesting that you picked people who have very intersectional positionalities too, in the way that you can kind of reflect on yourself and kind of see and kind of reaffirm through both their story and yours. And I think that's really powerful.
Thank you.
But I was curious also to think, going back to historical elements for people who, have never had really interaction with just the trans community. But even learning about this, I had no idea before I took your class about how influential the trans community was, serving as a catalyst for the gay liberation movement.
Oh, absolutely.
And so I was curious I know we've kind of talked about a couple, Marsha P. Johnson and Miss Major, but I would, if you want to kind of go more detail about that and how, they really involved themselves and how it was actually very transformative for the movement.
Yeah, that's a great question. For audience members who don't know, Stonewall was started by trans women of color. It was Marsha P. Johnson, Miss Major. It was Sylvia Rivera, who are all our icons, who are all since have either passed naturally or were murdered. So rest in peace to those three legendary icons. We just lost Miss Major a month ago. I actually had to cancel class because I was devastated because her book and her work has inspired me. And so what's so instrumental about Stonewall is that trans folks have been the catalysts and the ones who've been pushing for equality and advocating, right? And so Stonewall began from that. The Marsha P. documentary on Netflix, I think, is a really great example of that and tells more in-depth stories. So I would refer people to learn about Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera and the legacy of their work. But that work transformed into that moment. But what happened after Stonewall, it was taken advantage of and whitewashed, right? The eradication of these transgender icons who contributed so much to the movement have been completely removed. Jules Peterson, who's a transgender scholar who's at Johns Hopkins, talks about that and wrote an article about how Sylvia Rivera was pushed back and not welcomed by our own LGBT plus community. Remove the T, right? Because they saw trans people as freaks. They saw trans people as these psychos, right? And they did not value the community. And I'm not going to say that was everyone, but that was a lot of people. That still happens today. And so what this trans community, Sylvia Rivera and Marsha P. Johnson did was create STAR. I can't remember the acronym from the top of my head, but that was a place to support trans people who needed a space to live and survive. And so that didn't fully develop, but there's been this history of trans people who just have not been welcomed or accepted and who are often forgotten and not recognized.
Yeah. I think it was really surprising for me just to realize that even like, I think often in LGBT plus community, we just associate that all of them band together and we're on the same issues about certain things, but how you look at the community and we're even divided in so many elements, even historically.
Yeah.
You're not even adding in the trans community, because I feel like, I don't know, like if you could speak to this, but contemporary now, like at least as I was growing up, I like my classmates were trans, like it was very normalized, and even I would be educating the adults around me about it, and it felt so normal, like it didn't feel like there was a division, like personally. So I'm curious to see like what you think, like how this, you know, relates to modern times, and like even like looking at these figures, how much of the impact they have made toward, you know, just the modern contribution of, you know, the queer movement and as such. But if you can speak to that.
I can try as best as I can. I think we need to trace the history. We think about Stonewall, but we also don't think about the cafeteria riots that happened a few years prior from Stonewall, where trans women in San Francisco fought back against the policies and laws that were, you know, penalizing people who were cross-dressing, right? And there were those laws and policies have existed for centuries, literally since the 19th century. And so we've seen those movements in Stonewall, then we saw that movement in the AIDS crisis where we didn't recognize, and I think what you were able to read in our class was that trans people have been caretakers. There's a spiritual kind of thing about trans people that step up and do things for the work of the community. And so we read about Miss Major, Marsha P. Johnson, and other trans women and trans people and expansive folks who were the caretakers during the AIDS crisis, who are not acknowledged, who are not celebrated. And you also got to read about how some of those individuals were gifted the dying folks as like estates and being sued by their family because they were giving thousands of dollars or actual homes and vehicles, right? We don't talk about how when the AIDS crisis was happening into the 1990s and the 2000s, that, you know, there was not accepting of talking about trans experiences and how they were being impacted by AIDS, or that drug manufacturers weren't releasing a drug that they already had access to that could have prevented a lot of deaths, right? And then we think about now about trans experiences and, you know, we try to create this cohesive relationship, but it's not the case. And there's division within the trans community, right? And so an example, I think, for me that emerges most recently, probably within the last decade, is when the Marriage Act was passed in 2015. There was conversation about whether it was going to be removed this year, but I think the Supreme Court decided not to enact that, or to review the case, but Janessa Gutierrez, I cannot pronounce her name, I'm so sorry, was a notable figure who is a trans Latina migrant who moved here. And she's an activist, an advocate for the trans community, particularly the trans immigration community. And when Obama was celebrating the Pride Month in this moment, she stood up and said, Obama, release all trans people from the detention centers. And the immediate reaction of the entire crowd was boo, shh, and silence. They silenced her, because a lot of the community don't think that there are so many intersections that trans people live in, from not being welcome to society by not passing, whatever that means. Not all trans people want to pass, right? Or not having access to citizenship or resources, right? And so there's a lot of separation and fighting within community, and there's also a lot of whiteness. So it's a very difficult road.
I feel like what came up to me when you were speaking was literally the book that we read, the So Many Stars.
So Many Stars,
yes.
Yeah.
About
Guerrero de Verdes, yes.
It's basically a oral history, transgender, two-spirit, non-binary, just kind of talking. It was like multiple narrators, 20 narrators, kind of debriefing about their personal experience and telling their truth. And honestly, through that, I was really able to hear the intersectional elements very clearly of like having a trans identity and then also just coming to the US to be supported in a way, and then also getting that negative backlash. So it was just like,
Yeah.
it's just kind of sad to see that even a place of trying to find security, community, we're also met with pushback, erasure, silencing.
Yeah, and it's unfortunate, right? And the reason I chose that book for us to all read, including myself, again, was to think about trans voices, and particularly in the immigration community, who come here, and there's this misconception within our society that immigration is this process where people just gain access to the resources that citizens within our own country can access. But it's not true. We see those stories of the trans folks who migrate here, who are sexually harassed and assaulted by police, right? Who are not given the resources to survive, who are often imprisoned because they don't know how to navigate this new system, who are oppressed by the community because they don't look like the normative, whatever that means, gender norms. And so I really wanted to show that book because it shows the complexities, I think, of you were talking about, the intersections of these folks' lives, but also what it means to transition and doesn't look the same, what it means to have a chosen family and find people who you feel and love and who you can gravitate towards you, and not being accepted by your own biological family. And I'm using quotations, right? And so it's so complex, and I would encourage folks to read that book, So Many Stars by Caro de Robertis. It's a really good book about oral history of figures that are known and unknown.
Yeah, I honestly, not knowing a huge amount about the community and be able to read so many people's stories was pretty transformative in the way that I even absorb trans history. And I think often, like, when you read, like, textbooks or certain elements, there's you kind of misplace, and it feels kind of far away, but like hearing these people and be able to verbalize like their experience, it feels more personal, more intimate in the way I was absorbing the information. So I really encourage people to start there too. Like, if also like about resources to learn more about the community.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
And I guess as we were talking about kind of content and media and stuff like that, I was wondering like how you think the trans community is reflected in media, and like is this part of the like certain aspects of like what's like expected, like if you're not meeting like what you already previously mentioned, not meeting this standard of like transition and those impacts of how it's even digested by people in the community. So I was wondering if like what do you think about media and the trans community?
Yeah, I think it's been highly problematic. And so I'm not a media studies expert, so I can't talk about the history of media and so forth, but there is a documentary called Disclosure, which you got to watch in class, that really talks about the extensive history of trans representation and how it was indoctrinating not just us, this generation, but even our parents and our grandparents who have watched media, and all the representation of trans identities are often vilified as murderers or psychotic, or who are like weird, grotesque people. And just, you know, I'll throw out some titles for people who aren't aware. Ace Ventura, where they showed a trans woman being turned around and showing, you know, a depiction of tucking, which I won't go into full detail, and people vomiting. Let's think about Silence of the Lambs with Anthony Hopkins and I think Jodie Foster, where Buffalo Bill, which is often thought of as a trans representation in media, is a psychotic person who's killing women and wearing their skin, right? And so we have these depictions of transgender identities, and they create negative ways of thinking about trans people. But we've also, those references are from the 1990s, but we've seen even in the last decade of representation of trans identities. It's so interesting enough, my friend and I, Dr. Erin Green at UNC Greensboro, who I love so dearly, she really, and I spend a lot of time together and talk about some of these issues, and we're both incredible women, but we watched Caitlyn Jenner's coming out little series, and we talked about how problematic that was, and how Caitlyn Jenner was really kind of propelled as this figure and representation of the trans community. And in that, I don't think we told each other, we don't hear Marsha P. Johnson's name in that documentary. I don't think we heard Miss Major. I don't think we heard Celia Rivera. What we heard was these trans women, a lot of trans women of color, educating Caitlin how to be good and be a good advocate. But then we've seen her now, and she depicts trans people as horrible, horrendous ways. And so I feel like the representation of media of trans individuals have not been accurately portrayed. And so it's highly concerning. And so there needs to be better representation of what it means to be trans. And so some things that, even though Ryan Murphy is problematic, I think Pose is like a somewhat good example of that work. It's really been monumental for me. I think Kumahina's work in her documentary is also a really great representational kind of artifact of trans experiences. So I would refer folks to look at that and start investigating and educating to see what other representations can be uplifting.
Do you feel like the representation is becoming a lot more popular or positive? Because, I don't know, like, I feel like in consumption of media, I guess there's more normalized, like, exposure toward queer and trans identities. Yeah. But do you still think those are not accurate depictions, or like what are elements are problematic? I think we were even talking about a film and like who they cast is important too. Like, stories.
A lot of trans people aren't representing themselves in these media representations, which is what Susan Stryker and many trans people have acknowledged. Trans voices aren't telling trans stories. So, and Jules Peterson has talked about it. There's so many scholars who have talked about that. And so, do I think there's any good media representation now? How honest can I be? Can I cuss on this?
Yes, be honest.
Fucking nothing. I do not see anything that is empowering, exciting, reflective of who I am, who my trans sisters and brothers are, for those who are my trans expansive people. I have not found that representation, and it's still inherently missing. And we're not hiring trans people to do the trans work and representation, so...
I feel like that's also just the aspect of how it harmed the trans community as well.
Absolutely.
When they like use people, like we were talking about, like I don't know which was the film with that famous actor who like played the role and got an award for it.
Oh my God, I don't know his name, but I can't even think of the title of the film, but I know what you're referring to. Came out like in 2012. What was that film? He was in Harry Potter, not the series, but he was in the newest kind of adaptations. What is that film? I can't think of it.
I have no idea.
I can't remember, but it was a straight actor who won all these awards and Oscars for playing a trans woman, but was a straight cis, so identified with her biological sex male, and who revert back to that. They've also shaded Jared Leto for doing the same thing for the Texas Buying Club or whatever that Dallas whatever film was, right? So these reputations just signify it's a larger issue, and we don't hold them accountable.
Yeah, I really was kind of shocked by that element, and then also just like realizing how it actually feeds into this like narrative of like they're just playing dress up, or like they're switching, and out of like it just really, even how like the dimensions, not only just the film itself, people are like, oh, the film is great representation, but like looking at the layers of who's playing it and how even the transition of them like out of their acting outfit and then just coming in and getting their award as it's just a very complex thing, and we don't even realize how those unconscious aspects influence the perception.
It does, and I think it really shows that I can't speak for the trans community as a whole, but, from my experience and the people who are my trans sisters, brothers, and non-conforming individuals who are gender expansive, when we go home, we don't change. When I'm out in public, I look the same as I do at home. And so this is really kind of violent because I don't think people realize what it means to be trans in a time where we're not valued or accepted, right? And I know we're going to go into it a little bit more, but what I mean by that, and I'll share a little anecdote, which I usually don't, but I really want to highlight this moment, and that is, I did not transition till just this past summer, because I was afraid of transition, because of media representation, because of the backlash, because, trans people are killed at higher rates than cis people. I literally took a leap of faith and had a moment and breakdown with my friend. And I remember saying, I don't feel happy, and I haven't felt happy, and I don't want to live anymore, because it really felt like, I just didn't feel who I was, and I've been holding it in as at that time, about a year ago, I was non-binary, so I, got to switch back and forth, but I just felt like I wasn't living authentically to myself because my past work environment didn't feel safe or comfortable to be who I was. My PhD program didn't feel like a space I could do that. My MA program, I didn't feel like I could do that. In my BA program, same thing. At community college, I felt really kind of isolated. I was also homeless. And so there was never a moment where I felt safe. But this summer, I had real trans people around me, and I had real people in my life who I saw were thriving and living in joy. And it's so interesting because I watch these representations of media of people being happy. I don't know if you ever see that, and they're crying because of happiness. Mm-hmm. I've never experienced that in my life till like about a month ago, where I was just indulged the way that I wanted to be, and people referring to me at event as my name. And I remember I wanted to cry in that moment because it was for the first time in my life I felt like me, and I felt like I was living authentically. And it was the most beautiful moment, but also it was the most heartbreaking moment because I waited 36 years to finally make it happen. Mm-hmm. So when we talk about media representation, we gotta think about the larger implications. We gotta think that it could prevent trans people from wanting to exist. We gotta think about how it can make them feel like the only ways of living is being ridiculed. So there are real major impacts.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you for sharing such a vulnerable part. I feel like
that'll be in my book.
Oh yeah, I'm 2028. Period. Honestly, I feel like the intricacies of how you articulated that was super powerful.
Thank you so much. I'm too open. You see that in my class and in events. I'm open because I wish I had someone that was doing that when I was around. Let people call me whatever they want. I've heard it all. And I tell you all the time, and I've told other folks in public, I'll take my wig off and break a nail. Say what you want because I'm happy. I'm content. I'm comfortable. And I'm living in my truth. And it's really about supporting people who don't have the access or the representation. So... And it was interesting, a few weeks ago, someone told me privately, I won't say their name, but was like, be wary of what you're doing right now in public at your new institution and all these types of things, because even though you think you're being brave, there's real consequences. And that was a true statement. That was a statement of care. That wasn't a statement of, stop doing this, but it was a statement of, there are real consequences to this work. And I said, well, this is what I want my legacy to be, is to give people the joy and healing that they can exist in a way the world tells them they can't.
Oh. Yeah. Well, we see you.
Oh, thank you.
And we support you.
Yeah.
And I feel like this community, we're here for you.
Listen, I love Santa Clara University so far, so I appreciate you all too. Yeah, and we love you, Shelly. We love you.
I feel like it's so easy. I feel like just the space, the environment you create, the impact, the way that you talk about things, it's all impactful. We all hear it.
Thank you.
People, even students such as me, I feel like your impact is strong.
Oh,
and
I appreciate
your constant bravery, compassion, and the way that you even talk about yourself and be open to create spaces for everybody.
Yeah, I try to. Oh. We'll see.
So sweet.
Oh, I don't know
Got
about that.
Got me in tears. On the break.
I was like, can we get a fan and a box of Kleenex? And then can I get a mascara and makeup touch-up for them sweating? Thank you. No one who's here, because that's true. But in my mind, we have an entourage.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
On our beck and call.
Yes.
So I guess now we're gonna wrapping this up.
Yeah.
I think going back to the day that is coming very soon.
Oh yeah.
Trans Remembrance, and I just kind of want to talk about why trans remembrance is essential for understanding the history and struggles for the LGBT community as a whole.
Yeah.
And just kind of going back to like why this day is so essential for us to recognize and our community to hear out.
Yeah, Trans Day Remembrance. It's a hard day for me. I'm going to be, we're not in class tomorrow because I'm traveling to Puerto Rico, and I'm literally at a conference on Thursday talking about this very issue. Transgender Remembrance Day is an important topic and history, and part of our history. It's almost 30 years old because transgender people are dying at higher rates than our counterparts. In 1999, this was kind of developed by a transgender advocate, Gwendolyn Ann Smith, and she created a vigil to honor the memory of Rita Hester, a trans black woman of color who was killed in 1998. And so we hear about these trans stories, and it's continue actively happening today. And so this day is to honor the lives about the trans folks who die, who commit suicide, who are murdered, because we don't talk about their stories, right? Which I think is important to talk about. And even today, I got a call from a colleague of mine on the East Coast crying because we found out that a TikTok star influencer was killed yesterday, I think, or a few days ago. And her name was Girl Lala. And I knew of her because she was a wig influencer, and I wear wigs, right? I'm genetically balding, so wigs are my life. But it was from Black trans women that I was learning from how to put a wig on, how to do those things, how to learn that literacy of navigating the gender that aligned with who I was. And so it's sad to hear that Girl Lala was murdered by her boyfriend, and was violently treated, and what was more, that's heartbreaking enough. I was like, oh, don't cry. But what was more heartbreaking is that we talk about media representation and how the news organizations were referring to her by her dead name. By her dead name. And so we talk about Trans Remembrance Day because it's a way to honor the legacy of those who are murdered, killed, and who don't have the chance to thrive in a space where we're not welcomed. And it's because of stories like that where we are depicted inaccurately, so we claim that and tell the stories of who actually are meant to be here.
Yeah. Very, very powerful.
Thank you.
I guess to follow up on how does remembering trans lives, especially these lost to violence, help expose the systematic forces and that target trans people today, and especially policies, and how it even creates that narrative and resistance if like these are happening in the legislation levels, how is this even going to impact the social level as well? So hearing to that.
Ooh. That's a hard question. That's a deep question. I think it showcases and counters that we are here and we exist. We're showcasing the legacy of people where a system has not been designed or intentionally made for them. And we're countering those institutional logics, whether it's policy, law, or societal discourse or media representation, by countering and pushing back against those ways of saying, no, they do exist, here they are. I think one of the biggest challenges of Transgender Remembrance Day is the fact that it's hard to collectively advocate and celebrate transgender voices because we see from media representation that dead names are used, or they're inadequately represented, or being trans is excluded. So that list that we read out loud is never expansive, but it really showcases that we are here and we've been here. And so it's pushing back against that discourse that we aren't here.
What do you wish that people knew about the trans community? And like even from this episode, wish they will carry through them and to be able to say.
Yeah, I think like all people, we're not a monolith, right? And what I mean by that is like there's not one way of being trans, and trans people are more than what is being perpetuated by discourse in the dominant culture. So what I mean by that, again, like media representation and so forth, what we've talked about, but like trans people are the ones who are your caretakers. They're your educators, like me. They're your service workers. They're people who are trying to thrive and live in a world where they can exist and be who they need to be, but also be incredible figures they already are in their lives and their community lives. And so I just think there's so many misconceptions of what it means to be trans, and we really need to take a look and think about trans people have existed. And what I mentioned in the beginning of the podcast is that we've been here since the antiquity period. So get it together.
Period.
.com. .edu. Educate yourself. I always joke with you all and to our viewers, I'm going to get fired because I'm too colloquial. I'm not as academic as I should be until I'm like really fancy, or I'm interviewed in a very like fancy kind of way. But yeah, this is how I am in my teaching. So if you want to take my course, come take my course.
Yes, please. I honestly feel like I'm really going to take a lot from this course as I move forward. And just I'm very thankful to like even have like my last year and be able to have the opportunity to learn this content that's so important and to just carry through when I interact and talk and educate, and also just being just present and like wanting to be more of an advocate, and then already more spaces that need to be.
Yeah, I appreciate that.
I guess as we look at this and kind of wrap this up, I wanted to just kind of an aspect to call to action to these, viewers. And, a lot of them are probably wondering, how do I start learning? How do I start to educate myself on this community? So I was wondering if you had any film recommendations, book recommendations, and how do people get involved into helping the community?
Yeah, that's such great question. I think, sorry, this chair is so noisy. I think what you just alluded to is that education is important. And so I think that is the first step. We are being influenced by social media and these individuals who are not experts about what it means to be trans and so forth. But I would refer to look at the experts who have talked about trans existence. I think Susan Stryker's work on transgender history is a pivotal text that people should refer to. I know that she, as a transgender icon, is coming out with a new updated version of transgender history that should be released next year. And I think people should refer to a text like that to hear about the existence of trans people in the history and conceptualize the impacts of trans people. But I also think that there are, podcasts that are also doing that work. I mentioned Amara Jones, who's not just a storyteller, but is also someone who's a journalist and interviews actual historians and people about trans issues. So, maybe if a book isn't your cup of tea, there's a podcast, and Amara Jones is a great example of that. I would also think about media representation. I know we talked about it a little bit, but I think Kumahina's work is really important because I think it shows the legacy of colonization and how it tried to eradicate the Mahu people, but Kumahina is living proof of that manifestation of Hawaiian culture and pushing back against those colonial legacies. And so there's so much, I think, education that can be absorbed now. And was there another question? I can't remember.
I guess, how can people get involved in the community?
Yeah, and how can people get involved? I think the first step is educating yourself. But 2, if you aren't trans, learn from trans people and find ways you can support them by allowing trans people to be the leaders of these movements. Let trans people tell trans stories. What I will also say is the importance of educating oneself about trans experience is the ability to demystify conversations about trans people. And so what I always tell my students is to think about the entire thing they've learned this quarter, right? They might not be a transgender expert, that's not the objective, but they've heard trans history, stories, the intersections of living, undocumented to finding chosen family. And now they can be someone who can go into a room maybe that is highly not into or aware of trans issues and might be talking inaccurately about them. They can be the voice that says, hey, I hear you, but there's actually history. There's actually stories. There's actually documented data that showcases that you're actually inaccurate. I would encourage you to like really sit with that and think about that, right? So I think people think that stepping in and going into this work is about, you know, going into these huge social justice movements, volunteering at organizations. No, it happens within the interpersonal. It happens with those daily interactions. And people can be the person who can really kind of advocate and support trans people in these places where often people are the most vulnerable and people who are the most truth-telling. Because I don't know if you know, or if you want to speak to this in a way, or if you concur, but sometimes the realest conversations is with my family. And we talk shit, right? And it's problematic too, right? And so like, imagine me being a trans woman of color. My family is entirely religious, and I'm coming in there as a trans scholar, being like, let's think about it this way, right? So we can be really huge advocates and activists by engaging in those small, minute moments where people think it's not actually doing the work, but it's actually doing that work.
That's super powerful. I feel like often, like when you think about putting into advocacy, you think about the parades, you think about the marches, you think about the protests, but a lot of the core work is the interactions that you make during the daily and be able to carry yourself and be able to articulate these points, a certain amount of respect, and to give that certain amount of history. People might have a course of thinking differently, and it might transform them as well. So I really appreciate that you alluded toward that.
Yeah, I love that.
I guess we're going to just wrap it up from here. And I just want to give the space to thank you for being so vulnerable and giving and educating the students of Santa Clara about this. And it's just very powerful work that you're doing, and I'm quite inspired by it. So.
And you know what I would tell folks too, like, I get it, you know, there's a lot of discourse and pushback against trans community, and I don't blame people. I just think that a lot of education's not there. And I think there needs to be conversation where it can be productive and not combative. There are people who are combative that I will not engage with, and I'll move forward, and we won't say what and who. But I'm also always happen to have conversations about what it means. And I can only talk about my lived experience or the individuals I learned from, like Susan Stryker, Jules Peterson, and so many incredible other, C. Riley Snorton, so many incredible trans scholars of color, Joe Shu, who I love too. But I just think I think folks need to really sit with themselves and say it's okay to feel uncomfortable and learn something that they're not used to. Because when you're dealing with uncomfortability, you're dealing with realizing that what you were indoctrinated wasn't truthful and wasn't telling the whole story of the world. And we are complex. We all are complex, so. Yeah.
Oh my gosh. Well, thank you again. And we'll put the resources and the link of whatever platform you are listening to. And just see you on the next episode. And remember to share love, y'all.
Share love, trans joy.
Yeah.